I think these are evolutionary. I think autism is evolutionary. I think that ADHD is part of evolution. If I was going through the jungles on a hunt, I want somebody with ADHD on the point because they're looking at everything everywhere. The way I think of the autistic individuals is we tend to have looser connections, emotional, cultural kind of connections. That was the merchants. That was the people that were crazy enough to get in boats, go halfway around the world to get some tea and come back. It's not that you have a disease. Really, it's an evolutionary trait. I think the biggest cause of it going from being a benefit to being now considered a detriment is the Industrial Revolution.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Today I'm speaking with Tim Goldstein. Tim Goldstein is a neurodiversity communications specialist, an educator, and a public speaker. Tim has a background in tech and has worked with many companies like Chase Bank, Macy's, Citizen Bank, and many others. Interestingly, Tim was diagnosed with autism at the late age of 54, and since then, he's gone on to become an advocate for neurodistinct people who deviate from what would be considered neurotypical in our society. Tim has spoken on this topic to groups like Microsoft, Cornell University, the Stanford Autism at Work group, the Society of Industrial and Occupational Psychologists, Google, and many other organizations. In this episode, Tim and I discuss neurodiversity in general and the benefits of different ways of thinking and perceiving, such as ADHD and autism. We discuss how work can be designed to better meet the needs of neurodistinct people and the benefits that companies can gain from designing work with them in mind. We also talk about communication differences between cultures because Tim argues sometimes autism is best understood as a culture. We discuss how to recruit and retain diverse talent as well as a lot of other topics. It was, as always, a pleasure speaking with Tim. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And now I bring you Tim Goldstein. Tim Goldstein, welcome to Work for Humans.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Now, I think of you as a neurodiversity activist, as somebody who's out there on the front lines promoting ideas about neurodiversity. Do you see yourself that way?
On one hand, I guess I do see myself that way because I am actually doing that. And then on the other hand, I think this is the imposter syndrome part kicks in and you kind of go, I don't know, I'm just like, a regular person. What am I doing? But I don't know, I guess people tell me that I'm an activist and I do talk to a lot of people and companies about this stuff. So I guess I have to consider myself an activist.
How did you arrive at doing that?
Now there is an interesting story. First off, I wasn't diagnosed as being autistic until I was 54, which is not unusual amongst people, in our age category, because, back when we went to school, 60s and 70s, autism was nonverbal children. So I'm obviously quite verbal. I could not have been autistic at that point. And then went through life, got out of school. Workplaces knew nothing about it, so obviously not caught there. And finally got diagnosed at 54. Just so happens at the same time, my wife and I were attending seminars to learn how to monetize your knowledge. After you've spent enough money and taken enough of those kinds of things, you figure you should produce something to see if you actually learned anything from it. And I was trying to figure out what, it's like, what do I want to do it about? Because, I've been an entrepreneur. I've been in multiple, careers and industries. I'm in the tech industry. And it finally dawned on me that one of the things that I got really, really good at was interviewing, which is kind of odd for autistic individuals, but I did get good at it. And I kind of chalk it up to a lot of sales experience in my earlier careers. And I wrote a book called Geek's Guide to Interviews, 15 Critical Items for the Technical Type. So there you go. From getting fired, multiple times, it turned into a book. And I was at a Autism at Work conference through craziest of things, saw an article written by Lori Golden. And Lori Golden happens to be the head of HR for EY. So being an autistic individual that, isn't worried what anybody thinks about me, I just emailed her. And she responded and we connected. And she said, "Do you know about this conference?" And I said, "No." And she said, "I'll take care of it." And I don't know, a couple hours later, I get an email from SAP, who was hosting it, and there was my invitation. So I went and attended the sessions. It was very, very interesting because I was still really getting my head around what does being autistic really mean. And one of the people that I identified there was a woman, Suzanne Briere, who's professor at Cornell. I just identified her because she happened to stand up and ask a question of one of the speakers, and she identified who she was as she was asking the question. So I ran into her in the hall, and again, background in sales. I handed her one of my signed books and said, "Here, this might interest you." Then she ended up reaching out a few months later, asking me if I would want to teach one of the class sessions in her brand new neurodiversity class. And having grown up about an hour and a half from Cornell and not being a college graduate at all, the opportunity of teaching at Cornell was like, cool, yeah, of course I'll come teach at Cornell. And also I had taken a lot of training in being a public speaker. So it was plenty comfortable to teach a bunch of students. That was no big deal. And that was really the whole way it all started.
And I want to get to your training in public speaking a little bit later in the conversation because I think it's super important. But before we get there, I want to get to some of the things you've taught me about the neuro cloud and why you frame neurodiversity in that way.
Yeah. The neuro cloud. So I guess, just for the listeners so they can even kind of come up to speed of what we're talking about, because, you and I had the joy of being able to share images back and forth and such. You start out with neurodiversity. What is neurodiversity? And neurodiversity, I like to say, our eyes. I have blue. I can't quite tell. I think yours blue-gray. Are yours blue-gray? Yeah. And, but some people have brown, some people have green. And we look at ears. Some people's lobes hang down. Some people's lobes don't hang down. Some people's ears stick out. Some people don't. And we consider all that normal. That's just normal variation in humans. We don't think that you're strange or weird because, those blue-eyed people, those just watch out for them. What we don't think about is the brain. And then the brain being the most complex organ in our entire body, if our eyes can vary and our ears can vary, our brains should be able to vary too. And the reality is yes, they do vary considerably. And depending how your brain varies is going to control how you perceive, process, and think. And in a nutshell, that's neurodiversity. So now moving into the neuro cloud is, okay, now let's make sense of that. I get the idea, our brains vary and we're all kind of different in the way we think. Cool. Well, I was looking for a way to better express that. So I came up with this neuro cloud idea. And the first thing is the neuro cloud, I kind of describe it as think of, and this, you go to state fairs and carnivals and such, and they have that with, dollar bills or whatever, all floating in the air, and you're supposed to guess the amount or whatever it is. So think of that as just confetti and glitter all flitting around, and that's every way that any human can perceive, process, and think. So the first thing about neurodiversity is it's every human. Nobody gets out of it if they got a functioning brain. Just like diversity. Just because we're both white guys, it doesn't mean we're not part of diversity. Might be the problem part of diversity, but we're definitely included in diversity. So NeuroCloud, you got everybody in there. And things that are floating around and such tend to start clumping and grouping together. And, so in the NeuroCloud, things kind of start grouping together. And you get this one large group that is called neurotypical. And neurotypical simply meaning that, not that they're identical. Everybody's an individual, of course. But neurotypical meaning that they have a similar way in perceiving and processing and thinking, from an autistic standpoint, pretty emotionally driven, emotionally based, as we tend to be a little less so. And that's just your normal, what you would consider your normal average person is a neurotypical. I'm starting to think it's not the majority of people, but it's the biggest contiguous group, is the way I'm starting to think about it now. So we have neurotypicals. They kind of control what the norms are for a society, and we base our things off that. So then there's a group of people who think differently than neurotypicals. So in this cloud, we've got a chunk we just segmented off, neurotypicals. The other chunk I call neurodistinct. And neurodistinct as in definition of how do you divide between them? They think in a distinctly, or perceive, process, and think in a distinctly different manner than neurotypicals. And it's that easy. There's a whole pile of groups, not just autism. I mean, it could be ADHD, it could be OCD, it could be dyspraxia. I mean, there's tons of medical terms that fit in there. And there's lots of things that are no medical terms, but people who definitely are unique and different kinds of thinkers. They're not thinking like the typical, even though there's no medical tag to hang on them. So that, in a nutshell, is the whole idea of the neurocloud, of simply giving a graphical illustration of, first off, all of humanity is part of the neurocloud, and that there's a group that tends to set the norms, neurotypicals, and there's lots of people who perceive, process, and think and follow different norms because they're thinking and processing and thinking differently, and that's the neurodistinct. And furthermore, the further apart you are in the neurocloud, the more difficult communication becomes. So even if you take neurotypicals, go to the extremes of that clump, it's more challenging for them to communicate with each other. And if you have to go over, and it's really not a sharp line, it's more of a gradient of how differently are you thinking until it becomes distinctly different. But if you've got to go over that gradient, just add a lot of distance. It's like talking over an even further barrier, and the communication becomes much, much more difficult. So that is my concept of neurodiversity in the neurocloud and the neurodistinct.
So, all classifications to me are taking an analog world and trying to cut it into distinct categories. And I always think of that as like using a cookie cutter on dough. You can't do it without either leaving gaps or overlapping with the cookie cutters. You just can't. It's like super hard. So it so happens that the medical discipline has been the one to categorize and classify different distinct neurological patterns. How's that gone?
Well, first off, it was partially we're breaking this down and eliminating the cookie cutter because it really is a gradient. There isn't the sharp edge that's being cut. Maybe we're doing that fancy pastry with the fancy, zigzaggedy edge all the way around, really. So that's one of the first things is we're not following a medical model of saying, if it's this, this, and this, you're A. If it's not, you are B. Sometimes it can be hard to tell. Are they thinking distinctly different, or are you just not getting them right? And it seems like they're distinctly different. So that's one thing of eliminating it. We're not saying there are these sharp groupings. Secondly, in the neurodistinct, while we'll often use the terminology of, I'm autistic, it puts me in there, ADHD, whatever. The reality is we're not using them so much in the medical terminology, because if you self-identify, but you've never been diagnosed, or you're subclinical, so you wouldn't be diagnosed, you still are thinking much more in the nature of that kind of style. So the way I've started thinking about it, and with one of the people, Dr. Lutz Ireland in Australia that I collaborate a lot with, we started thinking about it as it's cultures. And there's a medical culture. And in the medical culture, we make sharp, defined boundaries, and we look at deficits because that's the medical lens to do what medicine does. But what we're really talking about with neurodiversity is we're talking about a social model. So it's not that it's not the same people, it's the same people, but we're looking at it an entirely different way. We're looking at it without sharp boundaries. We're looking at it as simply, again, the definition. Think in a way that is distinctly different. And it's really up to anybody to decide how different is distinctly different. For any individual, if you were to think about it in this cloud, if you were close to the edge where the dividing gradient is, distinctly different is going to be much further over than somebody who is all the way on the opposite end is going to see as distinctly different. So that's how I avoid the idea of the cookie cutter, is we're really saying this is a social model. It's not a medical model. Now, there's nothing wrong with the medical culture. If, I'm sick and ill and I need some help, I'm perfectly happy to accept the medical deficit and sharp-lined model, because that's what they specialize in. I kind of like to say, if we wanted to go get fine food and look at great art, we could go to Italy and France. They're kind of known for that kind of thing. But on the other hand, is every French person or Italian, a great artist and a great chef? No. So we're thinking of it more in that way. It's a culture. It's a cultural difference. And I think if we think of it as a cultural difference, it's a lot easier to approach it really under a DEI lens. It's really a diversity problem. We don't understand the other culture is the challenge.
There's two places I want to go. One of them is you've done, as I understand it, a lot of work around public speaking. And to some extent, that's about bridging a communication gap between one culture and the next culture. When did you know that was something you should do? And what did you learn?
There was a continuation of the journey of how to monetize your knowledge. If you've ever been into the whole seminar gig kind of thing, there's always another great deal that you can buy at that seminar to go to the next seminar. And there was one that was presented that they called World's Greatest Speaker. And my wife and I said, well, that sounds pretty interesting. And decided that we would attend the World's Greatest Speaker. It ended up there's 4 people that were teaching it. One was Oprah Winfrey's executive producer that for Anderson Cooper, they stole her away to start Anderson Cooper. There was another gentleman who is, they say, arguably the best vocal coach in the world and specialized in singers, but does a lot of speakers. And we could name artists that everybody would know instantly that have been his students. And then there was another gentleman that, crazy as can be, Crazy Bo. And Bo was a NFL football player. He was the first round draft in his position, so he worked pretty hard at it. Then when he got out, he decided he wanted to write a play. That's kind of a little shift for an NFL player. Maybe been hit in the head too many times, I think. And then after he got his play written, he decided he wanted to act out his own play. So he went and he was living in Santa Monica at the time, and he talked to, all the Hollywood types that he knew around town that met through his kids going to school. Wanted to know who the best actor was. They told him who they thought the best actor was. He said, I'm going to go sit down with them and find out how I can become a great actor. And they all laughed at him and said, yeah, right. And his agent called the other guy's agent, and they were having dinner a week and a half later. And the actor did chart out for him a 10-year path of this is how you're going to become phenomenal. And he took 10 years to do it and took his play from being in school auditoriums and churches and stuff to Broadway, and became a one-man play. And he was acclaimed as the most influential play of the decade. So these were the people that we initially started learning to be public speakers from. So I guess it's like anything. If you want to learn to be good, go learn from the absolute best. Don't go learn from the cheap version down the street. And we very much enjoyed that seminar. We got a lot out of it. And we decided we then wanted to go to each one of their individual seminars. And we ended up joining their masterminds. When you get done and said, I probably paid for a PhD, but because I was a college dropout, I never had to pay for one before. So, what the heck, I'll pay for my PhD now. And that is really how we became public speakers. And it's actually how I also ended up for the first time publicly saying I was autistic. And it was at one of Bo's seminars. And you got together in a group first, and you worked on a story with 4 or 5 people for a 3-minute story. And then you had to cut it to a 2-minute story. And then you had to cut it to a 1-minute story. And then everybody, one by one, went up on the stage, and you had to deliver your story in one single line. And my line was, I'm not like you. I'm autistic. The reaction from the audience was phenomenal. There was more interest. There was more everything. So that's really what got me deciding what I was going to be speaking about. Why did I want to be a public speaker? I wanted to make a difference in the world, and talking to them one at a time is kind of a slow way to get there. So let's learn how to do it publicly and to talk to a large group.
Would you say the kind of training you were getting there, okay, this is the trick with this whole interview, which is that there are times when I'm going to talk about your specific story. And yet in general, we're talking about autism as a whole. And so saying what the trap we can fall into is that we use you as if autistic people are the same and that we use your experience. And so I just want to make this distinction that there are things I'm going to probe on here that are going to be making that risk, which is that if you were right-handed versus left-handed and you were the only left-handed person in the room and we were to extrapolate from your left-handedness to all left-handed people, we'd be making a mistake. But I still want to explore your first-person experience of having discovered being diagnosed with autism along the way. So was some of the training that you got in terms of voice coaching and like that, do you think that it was part of bridging the cultural gap between neurotypicals and yourself?
Oh, it very much was. I actually go out of my way regularly to say, don't expect that the next autistic you run into is going to be like me at all. Most autistics haven't studied public speaking like I have. And a lot of autistics don't like speaking in public. They're just uncomfortable, with crowds and people and such. So definitely a little different there. But yeah, I think the part, honestly, that made the biggest difference was the vocal coaching. And the vocal coach specialized in singing. I mean, his first lessons he ever taught when he was 16 years old was at the Beach Boys. He was Michael Jackson's vocal coach. So when I say he is one of the best in the world, there's not just blowing smoke at it. And we studied with him for a couple of years, and yes, it cost a fortune. What he told me, I don't know, probably about 5-6 lessons in with him was, what I need to teach you to do is to put emotional sounds into every word you say. And traditional stereotypical autism, monotone, and every word's exactly the same length, and we go way too fast, and we don't breathe, and it's just like we're boring, and there's no flat affect, and there's just no emotion coming across. I mean, it's very common for people when they deal with autistics to, if you talk to them afterwards and ask what the interaction was like, for them to say, there was just like no warmth. It was like robotic. There was like nothing coming back to me. And that's what I was like pretty much before I did all this studying. And it was learning to put that emotion into your voice. And the reason he is so good at it is, while he certainly teaches speakers, the way he finally thought, dawned on him to teach speakers was, he thinks of it as simply the only difference between singing and speaking is how long you hold out the notes. Other than that, there's no difference between it. So if you want to communicate emotion, who are the best people at communicating emotions? Actors and singers, probably. He also does actors. So definitely, it has made such a difference in my life. And what's interesting about it is, though, it hasn't made a difference to me as far as intaking the information. I still cannot pick up emotional cues. I still stink at all that reading the room kind of stuff. But it has made the interactions and the connections orders of magnitudes beyond what I ever had before I learned to do this. Because it makes the person on the other side feel the warmth of a real human that they're interacting with.
It's interesting. What I want to get to is what this means for you at work and the challenges of being neurodistinct at work. And a couple of times you said that in your history, for instance, you didn't graduate from college or you didn't these other things. There's a culture to being in a university, and there's a culture to being in companies. And with your speech, you figured out a way to learn to bridge the cultural gap in one direction. How are companies doing at bridging the cultural gap with you? And in particular, I think about the way companies do things like job descriptions or performance management, and just communication in general that's full of imprecise language and yet, need to be used. So how are companies doing at bridging that gap in your direction?
In my personal opinion, for most companies, now there are some that are doing good. I don't want to say nobody is doing good. I don't think there's any major companies that are doing good, to be honest with you. The ones who are doing good tend to be much smaller companies where it's much easier to change and adjust the cultures. Really, it started out, the whole neurodiversity movement, to be honest with you, started with autism and the Autism at Work movement more than anything, which is really funny because we're probably one of the smallest groups inside the whole range of neurodistinct individuals. But, we were identified as they think we all have superpowers and every autistic individual is a phenomenal computer programmer or going to be a great cyber security person. And the reality is, we don't have numbers on the statistics, but talking to some of my friends that are in universities and study this kind of stuff, we think about maybe 10 to 20% of autistics are cut out to be in the computer high-tech world. But that's probably the same of the general population. About 10 to 20% is cut out to be in the high-tech, general world. But they decided because overall, the autistic community is either under or unemployed at a much higher rate than many other communities, that it would be a fertile ground to go recruiting from because, yes, there are a fair number of bright individuals that would make good workers in the tech world. And they're under or unemployed, so they're easier to recruit than the person that's getting offers from all 5 major tech companies in the US. That is how it all started, and it started all as recruiting. And in my mind, that is the number one thing that's caused a problem because it's been looked at as, let's go recruit these people who are just going to be phenomenal. But what they don't look at, and I just like to say, if we take any other area of DEI, let's just say people of color. I mean, not picking on them, but anything just as an example group. Could have been Latinx, could be any group we want. We go figure out why we're leaking them in our company. What is it we're doing that's making us, not retain those kind of people before we go out and we recruit more of them. Here, other than training the specific managers that were involved, they didn't change the culture of the company to be more accepting of individuals that think differently. They just recruited a bunch of them. And that is a huge problem because virtually any company, I say any company over about 20 people, there are neurodistinct individuals in there and probably an autistic one or two in there. I work for one of the major tech companies that, are in the 100,000+ employees. And I know of, just because of, we have a group of autistics, and there's about 450 of us in there. And that is definitely not all the autistics in the company. So why go out and recruit more when you haven't figured out how to keep the 400 or 1,000 or whatever the number is so that they can be as productive as they can be and want to stay with your company? So in other words, it's being done backwards. I call it Autism at Work 1.0 was let's just go recruit them because, wow, they're good pickings. And Autism at Work 2.0 is let's approach this as a DEI and a cultural issue. Change the culture of the company to be accepting of these people who bring in unique talents that we want. And really, the unique talent isn't that we're always great computer programmers. It's that we think, perceive, process differently. So when we look at a problem, we get to a different answer. Sometimes it's the right answer, sometimes it's the wrong answer, but it's a different answer than everybody else is going to get to. And I think that's really the strength. But how many cultures, how many companies have a culture where when you say something that's totally different than the way they're doing it, they say, that's not how we do it around here. Instead of saying, that's an interesting way to look at it. Never considered it that way. And that is where I think most companies are failing is they're trying to take a shortcut. They're just trying to bring in more and recruit, and they think they're going to get the benefit of diversity. And you only get the benefit of the diversity if you actually listen to the people who are different perspectives and use it. And that doesn't matter whether it's traditional diversity or neurodiversity.
I know why it looks like that, why it's 1.0 instead of 2.0. And it's because I've worked in this field for a long time, which is recruiting is a focused, active verb. You are going to do it to something. Whereas retention or loss is a more passive verb. Like, in other words, I can focus my recruitment effort on bringing in a certain population, but the reason that I lose that population is diffuse. it's not one thing I can do. It's probably 20 things that I'm not doing that is causing this turnover in that population. And so it's harder to find what to fix. And so I want to talk about that because when we look at sort of the diffuse, like, challenges that are being faced, and let's talk specifically, it'll probably apply across lots of different populations, but in the autistic community, where's the mismatch? And one of them you said is that when you come up with an idea that's different from others, it's rejected out of hand. What are other kinds of mismatches?
Communication. Autistics communicate in two pieces. Communication in the ideas that they have are different because of the difference in the perspective, and communication in the style of communication. I got what was it? It was off my website, from the contact form on my website over the weekend. Person who is manager, happens to have an autistic child, so they're a little more comfortable with the thing, has a employee that is autistic, and there is a problem of the rest of the group not wanting to accept them. And the reason why is twofold. One is behavioral, which I think is easy to fix, and that's that they speak too loud. And they're in a public-facing type thing where they are having to talk a lot and they're around each other when that's going on. That one's behavioral. I haven't had a chance to get back to this person, but you can get a nice little app that has a decibel meter on it, and good. Let's just decide if it goes over that bar, then tone it down. So no big deal. Just deal with the behavior. Who cares why the behavior is what it is? Let's just fix it. But the other part that they were complaining about is that person doesn't talk to the rest of the group, doesn't talk to them. They talk at them, which goes back to that autistic flat affect. They don't feel any warmth coming across, so they feel like they're just being talked at. So it's a social problem, really. It's a cultural issue. We could take many cultures. I was on a podcast, and one of the people on it is Israeli, and he probably now in his late 40s, and he grew up in Israel and was educated in Israel, and he moved to Western Canada 4 years ago. Actually, just moved back, sent me a text as he was in LA, getting on the plane to head back to Israel. He's telling me that, he had a hard time in Canada because, and this would be true of America also, because most of the communication was all between the lines. And in Israel, the Israeli culture, he's telling me, I have to take his word for him, I haven't been there myself, but he was saying in the Israeli culture, they're very direct, they're very blunt. I mean, they're just straight at it. And here in America, we dance around the bush. We say everything except what it is that we actually mean. And he couldn't figure out what the heck it is that was actually being said to him. So that's a cultural problem of let's try and understand that some cultures are direct, some cultures are less direct. Just because it's not your culture doesn't mean it's wrong. And that really ends up being probably one of the major challenges is communication that causes tripping over cultural issues.
Yeah, it is true that whenever I just notice in myself, when I'm in conversation with somebody, I am gauging the feeling that they're giving me. In other words, how is this person making me feel? It's something I actually said to my daughter. I said, your leadership needs to hear 4 things that make them happy for every 1 thing that makes them unhappy from you. Because if you give them cortisol, 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 they're going to stop listening. But if you give them dopamine, 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 cortisol, they'll hear the 1, but they can't hear them all 5 at the same time. And so it's important to be able to modulate that. And I can see why it's a challenge. And I can also see why it might not be something that if I were from one culture, I would value it enough that I would want to bend to what everybody else around me needed. It's sort of like, everybody else around me, just get over it. I'm talking straight. It seems like it would be hard to adjust in part because you just might not value it.
It's not that we don't value it. I mean, we value people. It's, being autistic doesn't mean you don't care, even if that is how it's coming across. It's very often that we don't process what's going on. Again, we're all individuals. I'm not the ultimate representation of autism. So we're talking, stereotypes, but, there's a reason stereotypes form. They're not totally wrong either. So what is fairly common, and it's actually part of the description in the DSM of diagnosing autism, is, challenges in communication and social interaction. And a lot of it deals with emotional processing, that we just don't process emotion. We tend to be, left brain thinkers. Now, what's interesting is females are tremendously underdiagnosed because they present differently. And I was actually just talking to a female autistic this morning, fellow worker at the same company, but works on the other end of the country. So we don't get to chat a lot. I was asking her about it because I always this is my, surveying to try and understand more of the community I'm part of. And again, everybody's an individual. So don't, anybody listening, don't take it. I'm trying to say this is how you have to be. This is just generalizations. But in general, if we're in a conference room and discussions going on, male autistics don't even notice that there was a shift in the room. We just keep bowling ahead and never even notice that things change. Female autistics tend to notice that there was a change in the emotions, but don't know how to react back and process with it. So they definitely get underdiagnosed. But either way, you can see it's a challenge with dealing with what do you do when the emotions change? The way I kind of like to describe it for myself is, let's say that emotions were a circle that is, 24 inches around. And sitting right dead bullseye in the center is you're just on the couch chilling and relaxing. And the further to the edge you get, the more extreme emotion, different emotions arranged around the circle. When you hit the 80% mark, I can start notice that there was an emotional change. But if I can't notice the emotional change to the 80% mark, what's my chance of saving the situation now? About none. So yeah, I think that just kind of looping back on it, I think very often it's not that we don't want to, it's we don't have the capability to adopt that other style. You wouldn't go up to a person who is in a wheelchair and just tell them, well, get up and walk. So why would you tell somebody who is autistic, which by definition has challenges in those specific areas, well, you need to be more aware of people's emotions? Well, just like the person in the wheelchair can't get up and walk, that's why they're using the wheelchair. As I said, I don't pick up the emotions well. I learned how to transmit them so I can create that warmth for the communication, but I still don't pick them up very well.
So, as you know, this podcast is about the design of work experience. And if I were just designing that as a product, like if I was designing that as a product always for right-handed people, and now I had to design the product for left-handed people, like let's say it's a baseball mitt, I would change my design. And so my question is, let's actually do a little work around designing a work experience for you that fits you. So I'm going to ask the question I ask everybody, which is, what job do you hire your job to do for you? What's it for? Your job hires you to do something for it. What do you hire it to do for you?
Well, there's first the obvious, answer of we live in America. It's a capitalistic culture. We don't have a phenomenal social, network to keep us going if we're not working. So financial is first because that's what you got to have to pay the bills and keep a house over your, roof over your head. Obviously, you could hire various jobs and fill in the financial gap. So let's just discount that because, I think that's going to be the first thing for most people. But now we'll get into why do you hire it beyond the fact that you need an income? And for me, it would be two things. One would be challenge. And with challenge, it's got to be challenging enough that it's really a challenge, but not so challenging that you don't think you could ever manage it anyways. So you can't be overwhelmed, but you definitely want something that's going to make you work a little bit hard to achieve it. Because, at least for myself, I think for a lot of people, there's a certain self-satisfaction in accomplishing something that's a challenge. So that would be the first thing. I would say now, And this one's kind of self-serving and probably somewhat unique to me just because of all the autism advocacy, neurodiversity advocacy I do, that it allows me to keep working and pushing forward in that field, whether that's internally or because of the connections through the company to other companies, whatever, because that's something that is important to me at this point. It's a driving thing in my life is to make sure that other people don't have to go through what I went through in my life of being fired so many times you have to write a book on interviewing finally.
Yeah. So, what kind of challenges?
I don't know what you describe it as. I guess we'd say, I'm a geek maker kind of person. I wanted to have a manufacturing company. Never been in manufacturing in my life, so I signed on the dotted line for, I don't know, $500,000 that I didn't have and opened a manufacturing company, which meant also I was the product designer, I was the marketer, I was all those things, which were all nice challenges. I enjoyed doing that. And I got to create all kinds of nifty, cool products that I can go Google them now and, they pop up and there they are with articles and people writing about how cool and nifty these things were. And I ran the company for 10 years. So I beat out, 95% of companies that fail before 10 years. And then I made a totally stupid autistic mistake, totally overtrusted somebody and lost $300,000 and then the company. And then computer programming. To me, whether you're building a physical item like I was in the manufacturing world and creating, a design that I thought people would like, or whether I'm writing computer code, to me, there's no difference except the tool set that you're using, the process of how you go about doing it. You make your best guess. You do that. You see if it works. If it doesn't work, you cycle back and decide what was wrong with it. In one case, you're using, machines and cutting metal and whatever. In the other case, you're writing code and testing it and see if it does what it's supposed to do. But they're both very, very creative processes of you're taking an idea that's in your head and turning it into a reality. And again, I don't see any difference between the two other than the tool set.
Yeah, and sometimes when I ask people this question, they will say, "I hire my job to build things." And whenever somebody says, which is close to what you just said, whenever somebody says that, I say, "Tell me what's in your garage."
We'll start with the formal dining room that nobody in the world uses anymore that has a filament 3D printer, 2 resin 3D printers, and a CO2 laser. Then we'll move to the basement, which has a full microbiology lab in it, and so on and so forth. That is something that is, again, and this is part of the diagnoses of autism, is special interests, that you have somewhat odd special interests, but at a very unusual intensity. Sometimes they can be common. I mean, there's certainly autistics that are into gaming, which is fairly common, but at their interest is at an intensity that's very uncommon. So am I over the top on these things? I always like to say that people like to hang out with me that were involved with this stuff because they could go back to their spouses and say, "I'm not bad. You should meet that Goldstein guy. He's like way over the top."
Well, and whenever I see that, and I've had such similar conversations with people who like to build, where their job may not be giving them all the building opportunities they want, or may not be quite meeting that need. And that's when you ask and they say, "Well, I've got a lathe in the garage, and
I have one of those.
I just sold my TIG welder." So let's say there's like this pure job for you that's the perfect job. It's got the right challenge. It's got you're getting to build stuff. You have enough spare time, or it's part of the main job to push forward the advocacy that you'd like to do. What's the cost of work? There's the part of your job which is sort of the pure good part. What's the overhead? What's the friction? What's the cost to you? Not the perfect job.
Right at the moment, I'm very fortunate that most of my job works pretty well for me, and I work for a manager that is extremely supportive of my activism within the realms that he can be. I mean, obviously, he's hired to do a job. I'm in a role that I'm supposed to deliver something that isn't activism, but he's very, very supportive of it. So I'm in a job right now that there's not really a lot of cost involved in it, to be honest with you. It's in many areas, it is very much things I enjoy. I actually do. The current role is I'm a technical trainer. I don't know. I probably started the first time I started teaching somebody was I was probably 18, 19 years old, and I taught cross country skiing because I worked for a bike and ski shop and started teaching cross country skiing. And I don't know, there's just satisfaction in helping people gain some skill that they want to have. And if it's a skill that helps them improve their lives, whether that's getting out and getting exercise in the winter or learning how to write some particular type of code that gives them a better opportunity, there's a pleasure in that. So I'm just very fortunate. If there was a negative, I guess the only negative would be, any big company that you work at, sooner or later you have the team get-togethers and all that kind of stuff. Then I run into the social challenges. I don't know how to join in the conversation. So that would be the only friction point, but that is tiny, tiny out of a year.
Right. And so where I'm exploring, and let's not take your job now, because what I'm looking for is how could we design work better for the neurodistinct population. And the reason is that there are people who are listening to this podcast who are actually in the business of designing the experience of work. And like everybody, we design it for ourselves to some extent. We don't understand other people's perspectives necessarily. And so I want to get into that perspective and know what great design would look like.
I've created a whole bunch of different tip sheets. While they were written, specifically around autism, the reality is 99% of it applies across the board. And there's a number of different things. Now, this one isn't on a tip sheet, but this is my answer when somebody asks me, what is it that makes you feel like you belong? And I think that's the first thing is you need to feel like you belong. But everybody says belong, but then they never give a definition of what belong actually is. I have the definition. It's really simple. I feel like I belong when people will listen to my ideas as if they potentially could be right. Not that they're going to take my idea every time, but they'll at least consider it as if, he does have some good ideas sometimes. Let's actually listen and think about this one. I think far too many people or organizations, if the idea isn't in the context they're thinking, it's just thrown out of hand instead of saying, totally different than I thought of, but might work. I'm going to give you a story. It's a short story, but I think it fits in. One point in my career, I was working for a woman who earlier in her career had been the highest paid female executive at Chase Bank. She was, some great title in marketing, SVP or something like that of marketing at Chase Bank. And somewhere in her career there, she had a boss that would take and bring in all his frontline reports, so 9, 10 people, and he would run by them the current challenge he was trying to work his way through. And then he'd go around the room and have each one give their idea of what they would do to solve it. And almost never did he ever do anything they ever said. Never. Okay, once in a while, maybe, but it was rare. She finally asked him one time on a one-on-one, why do you do that? Why do you ask us all and then just dismiss everything we have to say? And the guy was actually brilliant. He just wasn't smart enough to explain to them what it was he was doing. What he said was, I've already thought about this very, very deeply. I was just making sure there wasn't a perspective that I haven't thought about yet. Now, if he had told them that's what he was doing, it would have definitely been more cohesive and a better work environment. But what he was doing, really, that thought process of, I want to hear all the perspectives I can get to make sure I didn't miss one. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
So organizations that want to hear the different perspectives and consider them as if they potentially could be right. So I think that's one thing that would make a big difference in making people. And again, this has nothing to do with just being autistic or neurodistinct. This is dealing with, and that's the fun thing with dealing with neurodiversity, almost just anything you do that makes the neurodiverse segment more comfortable and work better works perfectly for neurotypicals. The difference is neurotypicals are willing to put up with it and play mind reading and such. The other groups just don't know how to do it and flounder. So I think that is a universal approach. If we were to actually listen to people as if they did have value to bring, sometimes maybe they will, sometimes maybe they won't, but at least you'll consider it. So I'd say that would be one thing that I would change. Another thing, and really this is what DEI efforts are all about, is getting people to be willing to accept that there's other cultures and other ways to look at things, and maybe they're not even ways that you like, but that doesn't diminish them as being people that are of equal value to you. So if we could get that across the board, just because autistics tend to be very blunt and very direct in speaking, they shouldn't be diminished as being, that's not acceptable, that's not how we talk to each other around here. Well, in my culture, that's how we talk. So why won't you accept my culture? Why do I have to conform to your culture? So I think that's a big thing.
Yeah. And it's something that I noticed when we were speaking earlier is that you've done a lot of work to conform, to reach out to a different culture. And the other part of the culture may not be making the same reach out toward you.
Again, if we just narrow down to autism specifically, although it probably applies more broadly, but we only know our own experience, so just talk from the autism standpoint. There's a big thing in autism about just trying to fake it and fit in. And it causes burnout. I mean, you know, how long can you not be you until it just doesn't work anymore? But the way I look at it is, I look at it as being tools. And if I want to achieve a certain thing, I need to have certain tools. So if I want to make an impact on the world, and that was actually my original goal when I finally decided I was going to start doing this stuff, my goal was I'm going to change how companies around the world interact with autistic individuals. And then the first speaking gig I did was to a company that had employees in every time zone or of all 24 time zones. So hit that one pretty quick. I recognized that I needed specific tools to do that. And I think of this as if, you and I decided we're going to go to France because, we want some phenomenal food that's going to clog our arteries, but it's going to be amazing to eat. We know we should probably learn a few words in French in order to break down the barriers. Again, generalization, sorry, all French people. But, the generalization is the French, if you at least make the attempt to meet them in their culture, they'll then reach out and bridge the gap because they probably speak English anyways. Is that making yourself be French and not being true to who you are? Or is that simply a tool that helps foster what we know it can be a barrier between us? I look at it as being a tool. And I wanted this tool that's called the ability to communicate to a broad audience. So I don't look at it as I am changing who I am. I'm looking at it as recognizing the tool I was using wasn't working very well, and I wanted a tool that would be better at doing it.
Is there anything else on that checklist of things that could be better?
Well, let's see. If we have, acceptance of cultures, which really is very broad, when you take things as simple as in general American culture, looking somebody directly in the eyes is considered to be an important factor. And autistics generally don't do that a lot. I actually had I don't know if I'd call it a wonderful experience. I don't have that challenge. I mean, personally, that is in the way I present autism. But there was a medication or I was sick. I don't remember what it was. And for about 2 days, looking somebody in the eyes was physically, searingly painful. And I did a little studying, and the studies are all on the opposite way around. Somebody who has problems looking in their eyes, and whether they're on certain antibiotics or he gets certain viruses, suddenly that goes away for a slight period of time. So I just experienced it the opposite way around. So when we say accepting other cultures, it's far broader than people think about what accepting another culture actually requires. If I don't look you in the eyes, does that mean I'm deceitful and lying? Well, unfortunately, humans in general are emotional beings, and we process this on a subconscious level. And we've already made the decision that you're not lying because we were cultured right all the way to our subconscious. Pavlov was true. We can make the dogs salivate if we want. We can ingrain into somebody to the point that subconsciously, if I'm not looking you in the eyes, I'm not honest. I'm not, being forthright. I'm not connecting with you. But if we take some other cultures, we take the Native American culture, it's considered very disrespectful to look at somebody in the eyes, particularly if it's somebody that is elder. You don't do that. So they run into the same problem that us autistics run into of, if you don't look into their eyes, then they don't take you very well, which then, first off, you probably don't even get the job because the interviewer didn't feel like you were going to fit in, like you were being honest, whatever. And if you do get the job, then nobody that you're working with is feeling that you're somebody that they really want to hang out with and associate and accept because you're violating so many of their social norms. But they don't ask, what are your social norms and how many of your social norms am I violating? Because majority rules. It's just the way it works.
When we were speaking once before, you talked about, I don't know if it was your experience or other people's experience of being told that they were wrong a lot.
I think it's any person who is neurodistinct, particularly autistics. And yes, I was talking firsthand experience in this case. If I've been told once, I've been told, a million times, why can't you do everything like everybody else? Why can't you be like everybody else? So essentially anything you do is wrong. You just never are doing the right thing the right way. I like to say I have PTSD around getting it wrong from being told so many times. And that was a big challenge to overcome. I mean, it really was hindering my ability because I didn't have, I knew I could do all kinds of cool things. I did them. I look back, there's physical proof of, yes, Tim can do all kinds of crazy stuff. I didn't feel like I measured up because bullying, and, bullying is, I guess, really being told you're wrong. People don't recognize it, but they're actually bullying also. Even though it's the teacher telling you, well, why can't you be like everybody else because you're being disruptive? That's just as much bullying as anything else is. And it is harmful. There's kind of a reason why if you have no intellectual disability, the average age of death of an autistic person is 59. And if you have intellectual disability, it's 38. How many years of you're not right, you don't fit in, you're not good enough, you don't measure up can you take before you just finally say, I'm checking out of this thing? And truthfully, it was the Broadway actor that finally got me over that. So everybody should go study acting. What can I say?
Wow. That's an amazing number, 59. In the last year, I was diagnosed with ADD. It's changed my self-esteem, in part because what I was attributing to myself as a moral failure, which isn't flaky, I found out was at least not a moral failure. It was still had the outward effect of being flaky. And by flaky, I just mean I'm fascinated. I'm absolutely passionate about the thing that's not relevant to whatever I'm supposed to be passionately interested in at the moment, which is usually school or something like that. And I was able to get through school just because very patient funding from my parents, I think, is what it was. It's really changed my own personal self-esteem. Plus Ritalin, which is sitting here right next to it. It's amazing. It showed me a different way of my brain working. It's been fascinating. But I wish I'd known it a lot earlier. And like you said, people our age, there was no diagnosis. This always showed up for me as testing high and grading low. So I got into college through my tests, but not through my grades.
That was me. I would ace tests and walk out of the room before anybody else was ever done, and I wouldn't turn my homework in. I'd do it, but I'd never turn it in.
Man, do I identify with that.
But, as far as ADHD, well, first off, my wife was late diagnosis ADHD. About 6 years ago, she was diagnosed with ADHD. And it explained a whole lot of things, just as you're experiencing. But I think these are evolutionary. I think autism is evolutionary. I think that ADHD is part of evolution. And I like to say, if I was going through the jungles on a hunt and there's, all kinds of things out there that want to kill us, I want somebody with ADHD on the point because they're looking at everything everywhere. So there's an evolutionary advantage to it. And I think the autistic individuals, the way I think of the autistic individuals is we tend to have looser connections, emotional, friendship, cultural kind of connections. That was the merchants. That was the people that were crazy enough to get in boats, go halfway around the world to get some tea and come back and spread culture around the world. I think there is very big advantages out of all of these different groups. And that's where when we're in the how would we design a perfect job, we're not looking back to why is it that humans develop this particular trait. I mean, ADHD is 7 to 8% of humans, and that's probably undercounting because people in our age group are not diagnosed. So it's probably closer to 11%. So obviously there was an evolutionary reason that exists. It's not just, there was something in the air that made suddenly this thing happen. It's been around forever. We can read back in various people. You can look back at them, read about their stories, their history, and you can start seeing the patterns that we would say, oh, that's probably ADHD that they had. That was probably Cavendish, creator of science. He was weird as hell. He did everything. I mean, he was like, everything was regimented. He always went for his walk at exactly the same time. Didn't like being around people. There's a story of ran into on the stairway one of his servants and freaked him out. So he built a stairway in the back so he never had to run into a servant again. But I mean, those would be autistic kind of traits. And of course, he came up with this whole concept of science, which was just revolutionary, which would fit in with autistic seeing the world differently, thinking differently. He came to a different conclusion than everybody else of the period came to. How do we leverage these things that it's not that you have a disease? I think I, anybody that's neurodistinct, really, it's an evolutionary trait. And you can take any one of the groups, and when you look at what their characteristics are, and I don't think there's an ADHD trait or an autism trait. I say there's human traits that in different groups show up at unusual intensities. Because we can find the same trait in all over the place in humans, just maybe not at the intensity it shows up in you or me.
Right.
But again, evolutionary driven, why don't we look in the workplace of saying, oh, there's these different groups that obviously had some value at some point because there wouldn't be 5, 10, 15% of the human population having it if it wasn't somehow beneficial to humans in some way. I actually like to say that I think the biggest cause of it going from being a benefit to being now considered a detriment is the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. It may be that the better paying jobs in particular are at one end of the economy. And by the way, that's funny what you said about hunters. I grew up spearfishing. It's always been one of the greatest drives in my life.
And you saw the fish that everybody else didn't notice.
I use this as an analogy all the time. There comes a point where you do it long enough and you can look at the sand and say, there's a halibut under that sand. I can't see a single thing that I know is a halibut, but I know. I just know it. How is the world doing at thinking of this as a diversity question as opposed to a defect? Where are we on that path?
If we were to put it on a 0 to 100 scale, we're at 10, maybe. Now, which is better than 5 or 6 years ago where we were at 2. So, that's a 5x improvement. That's definitely making progress. Most interestingly, though, the majority of the progress is not being made by the groups that should be making the progress. So in other words, the DEI individuals, the HR groups, they're just starting to catch on that there is this thing called neurodiversity. And they're even trying to figure out what's it even mean? What is it? The people who have been pushing and making neurodiversity happen have been the neurodistinct. We have put on, and I say we, the me and a bunch of my cohorts at work went and put on a global event to train managers on how to interact and deal with autistic individuals. Did we get everybody in the company to watch? No, but did we get some to watch and learn? Yes. And it wasn't you're wrong and we're right. It was a education about this is who we are. So really, it was an education of our culture and teaching how to go about doing some things. For instance, and this one works for ADHD and autism, probably other things too. I always say, don't tell us to go in two directions at once. I mean, how many times has a manager come up to somebody and said, here, do X, Y, Z. Oh, and also do A, B, C. Well, they're in opposite directions. I can't do them both at the same time, and they don't prioritize them for you. So now you mind read them, which most neurotypicals are willing to do the mind reading and fake it because they're embarrassed to ask. And that's the worst thing, is be embarrassed in front of, your group. Whereas, as autistic individuals, we've got that fear of, we've been told we're wrong so many times, so give me the damn details. Let me really understand what it is that you're actually asking for. So, and again, I think ADHD is the same kind of thing. You need some priorities given to you because your own self-driven priorities likely don't match the priorities of the person above you asking you to do these different things. So it just those kind of trainings of just teaching them. And again, everybody would really like to know clearly what they're supposed to do. But that it's really been the community. There was actually a call Tuesday, I think it was, for neurodiverse leaders. It was started by somebody from a huge consulting company that's, one of the major consulting companies in the world that happens to be autistic. And it wasn't their company doing it. It was just that's happened to be their employer. That's where they bought a job at. It was a who's of companies that were all just trying to figure out of how do we get this to move forward so that companies would recognize you don't have to go hire us. We're already here. What you need to do is start accepting us and learning about our culture instead of forcing your culture down our throats.
Yeah. One of the things that occurred to me in this conversation is that one of the leveling criteria at a lot of companies for job levels is autonomy and one's ability to do work on one's own without direction. A part of what you just said is that you can worry that you've been told you're wrong in the past, so you better check since it's not clear from the instructions. And I think that means it's hard to level up in a company if, in other words, there's a criteria in the job code that is describing don't ask clarifying questions, potentially.
And I think that's pure laziness. Flat out, that's laziness of management. Because I don't have the perspective that my manager has. My manager doesn't have the perspective that their manager has. None of us have the perspective that the CEO has. So how are we supposed to know what is going to be best for the company in what our role happens to do if somebody won't tell us what is important to them that knows more about what's going to be important than we know? I have this concept on work of what's happened. We went and we got rid of all the admins. And now everybody does their own work. You type your own stuff up, you send your own emails, you do it all yourself. So what happens now? Now you're too busy to do what you're supposed to do. So you pass off all the work that you can to the person that's underneath you, who then passes it off to the person underneath them. Except they don't have the insight that you have because they're not allowed into the same meetings you're allowed into. But because we went and decided that having a admin that costs, a fraction of a CEO, well, CEOs get admins, but, let's just take, software developers and people like that working at major companies. We're talking, good six-figure incomes. Not having a person that's going to cost less than a six-figure income that can take care of things for them so they can concentrate on what they really do, like help other people understand what's going to the most valuable use of their time right at the moment. That's just short-sighted cheapness. And we've accultured that into being, if you're not the person that can do everything and you do it all by yourself and you work until 17 hours a day, then you're just really not trying hard enough. No, we're not using human resources the way that they should be used. We should take the burden. So again, I guess we're back to the designing the job, the ideal job. Take the burden off the person that can be passed to somebody who doesn't cost as much to do the same thing at the same level of quality. If you have them typing emails instead of, developing revolutionary new ideas, there's a huge opportunity cost going on.
There's that. And there's also just the fact that maybe somebody else is going to like that work. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. It's been a delight, again, as always. So thank you.
Well, same here. Anytime I get to talk to you, I always, A, I learn things, and B, I have immense pleasure in having the chat. So another delightful conversation with you, Dart.
Thank you. Is there someplace that anybody can go that they can learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, it's real easy. Just go to my website, and it's timgoldstein.com.
And that is STEIN. So GOLDSTEIN. So timgoldstein.com. Well, thank you, Tim. Again, I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.